Hello everyone, welcome back to AMH 2020 U.S. Introductory Survey since 1877. In this video we're going to discuss the 1980s. And I'll begin by saying that in many ways the American life of the 1980s was a direct reaction to and a repudiation of American life in the 1970s, of politics, of culture, and just of how things were done in the country. The 1970s have been a decade of disillusionment for many Americans. The failure of Vietnam, economic stagnation, Watergate, and the capture of American citizens in Iran filled many with anger and discontent, and rightfully so. American life in the 1980s was a direct reaction against these problems as Americans looked to remedy the challenges of the previous decade. And when I teach American history, particularly when I teach about the 1960s, the social movements, the social change of the 1960s, the 1970s, the economic problems the country faced, the discontent the country faced, and the 1980s, the economic growth of the 1980s, but also some of the challenges that remained in the 1980s. I like to explain it this way. The 1960s were a crazy, you might say, drunken party where people are drinking and perhaps using other substances, and they're dancing on tables, and they've got lampshades on their head, and they don't really know what's going on. The 1970s are the hangover the next morning when you look around your house and you're like, how am I going to clean all of this up before my parents come? Your head hurts, perhaps you're hungover. And the 1980s is going out for breakfast with a hangover, eating a big greasy egg McMuffin from McDonald's or something like that. Maybe even having a little hair of the dog if you're over the age of 21. And you feel a little bit better, but are you really better? And that's how I like to explain the 60s and the 70s and the 80s. And so we'll begin this video in the 80s by talking about the 1980 election, Carter versus Reagan. We'll talk about its results. We'll talk about the presidency of Ronald Reagan, because he's president for most of the 1980s, and his policies are going to dominate 1980s politics and culture and society. And you see this in Reaganomics, economic policy domestically, drug policy. You see it with foreign policy as well, the stepping up of tensions with the Soviet Union, and the impact that all of this will have on American society. And we'll also talk about the culture of the United States during the 1980s as well, the growth of the conservative movement, its differences and similarities with other conservative movements, and we'll talk about media, fashion. I'll even bring in some material culture as well, because the 1980s was a decade of things like personal computers becoming much more available to everyday people, video game systems, new types of toys were available, and these things don't happen in a vacuum, and you'll see why they're really emblematic of daily life in the 1980s. I'll start by saying the 1980 presidential election was a clear attempt by American politicians to reverse the problems the nation had faced in the 1970s. This put the embattled incumbent President Jimmy Carter at a massive disadvantage. While Carter was a very principled man, as I've discussed before, presiding over the nation during 4 years of economic privation and serious foreign policy challenges, it really damaged his mandate for re-election. Voters would have still remembered him for his infamous crisis of confidence speech back in 1979, in which he called on Americans to sacrifice for the good of the country, a message that Americans were increasingly not wanting to hear in the 1970s because of all of the social fracture and social content. People did not want to be told that we're all in this together and we all have to work together, because everyone was very divided in the 70s. And the thing, of course, is Americans were already making sacrifices, and Carter was asking them to sacrifice more. They were heating their homes with wood instead of oil, because oil was so expensive. They were struggling to make ends meet. Maybe it was a true message, but it was not what the American people wanted or needed to hear. To make matters worse for Carter, he'd angered many of his supporters in the Democratic Party. He was often a micromanager. He often was very harsh to people who would have otherwise supported him. So in some ways that leaves him more politically isolated than he should have been. His calls for national solidarity are just not going to be successful. You see this division in the Democratic primaries, where Carter, even though he was president, he had to fend off Massachusetts Senator Ted Kennedy, brother of former President John F. Kennedy and Robert Kennedy. Kennedy had the right last name. He supported important legislation like the Immigration and Nationality Act of 1965. He'd also supported busing as well, perhaps to his own detriment. Um, Remember, the 1965 Immigration and Nationality Act ended national quotas, basically allowed anyone who wanted to come to America, greatly changing the demographics of the immigrants that were coming to America, and also just increasing general immigration into the nation. And of course, Kennedy's going to have no trouble attacking Carter's record. The thing is, Kennedy was undone by some campaign blunders, and his reputation had really just been severely damaged by the Chappaquiddick incident, in which Kennedy had crashed his car into a body of water while driving under the influence of alcohol back in 1969. The passenger, a young woman named Mary Jo Kopechne, who he was very likely having an affair with, she died in the crash. She was basically left to die by an intoxicated Kennedy. A really, really awful thing. Kennedy didn't even report the accident until the next day, probably to hide what he was up to. And this severely damaged his reputation, and rightly so. On the Republican side of things, we have California Governor Ronald Reagan. He had previously tried to run for president back in 1976 when Gerald Ford was president. And this time he won the primaries and he beat out several candidates, including John B. Anderson, who was kind of what was left of the liberal faction of the Democratic Party. He also beat out George H.W. Bush as well. Bush Sr. had formerly been director of the CIA, and he was less conservative than Reagan was. He will eventually, though, become Reagan's VP, and then after that, he'll be president. On the whole, Reagan's campaign was much more positive and upbeat than Carter's. He did attack Carter's record, but Carter really attacked Reagan for being a right-wing extremist and for being bad for the country. And Reagan attacked Carter as well, but generally was more demure, in his attacks. He would say things like, "Well, there you go again," and kind of make Carter look like he was really uptight and just not the right person to be president anymore. And Reagan was really good at reading the room, and this is because he had been an actor before he got into politics. And as an actor, he'd actually been fairly liberal. He'd been a Democrat and a supporter of the New Deal. He'd even supported civil rights as well and integration. He served in the Second World War, making training films and things like that because he was an actor. And even after World War II, he actually went against Joe McCarthy, who was going after unions. Reagan was a actor, so he was part of various Hollywood actor unions. As time went on, though, Reagan became more conservative, as often happens as people get older. He also became more religious as well, and he began to shift to the right politically. And people asked Reagan about his political change, and he always said that he didn't change. He used to say things like, "I didn't leave the Democratic Party left me." He also felt that extremely liberal and some cases communist agents had begun to infiltrate liberal organizations that he had once supported. Um, and he runs for governor in 1964. Actually, in 1964, he supported Barry Goldwater's presidency, even though Goldwater was a Republican and a very conservative Republican. In 1966, 2 years later, Reagan is going to run for governor of California, and he's going to win that election. And on the whole, he was a moderate Republican, moderately conservative governor in California. And in 1976, he's going to try to run for president, but he's going to lose to incumbent President Gerald Ford. You can see a picture of Ford with Reagan on the slide here, along with John Anderson, the liberal Republican, and George H.W. Bush, future vice president and president for after Reagan. So let's dig into the campaign in 1980 a little bit more. Carter will try to run on his strength as an incumbent, consistency, his work to free the hostages, which He was working very hard on this, but so far he had failed to liberate them. And as time goes on, his campaign will turn much more negative. It'll focus much more on attacks against Reagan, on Reagan's issues and stances and things of that nature, rather than on his own accomplishments. And Reagan, on the whole, ran a more positive campaign. He was pretty good at sort of deflecting Carter's attacks, making Carter look way too uptight, and things of that nature. Again, Reagan was an actor, so he knew how to deal with these sorts of attacks and how to make himself look good to the American people. He also made promises to fix the faltering economy, to intensify defense spending, and to bolster the U.S. reputation abroad after it had fallen in the 1970s. And there were attacks on Carter as well that were made by Reagan. So there's always some negativity, no matter what side you're on in a presidential campaign. Reagan promised to lower taxes to stimulate economic growth, and this was something that he believed would jumpstart the American economy and get us out of the era of stagflation. And this would also allow for more defense spending. We could counter the Soviet Union and rebuild America's reputation abroad. And Reagan's message, it resonated with many conservative people from a variety of backgrounds. His message is going to be popular with most Republicans, except for the more liberal Republicans that are still in the party, but are increasingly leaving the party. Um, and of course, the parties are changing significantly during this period. This is the beginning of a new party system. It's the beginning of the sixth party system, which starts in about 1980. And some would say it's still around. Others would say that it ended in 2016. And Reagan will garner support from Southern conservatives, many of whom would have voted Democrat in the past, and who feel uncomfortable voting for the Democratic Party, who feel it's gone too far to the left. Reagan did not promise to reinstitute segregation or the Jim Crow laws, but his talk about things like states' rights would have resonated with Southern conservatives who disapproved of the federal government for its role in ending laws that had discriminated against African Americans. Um, Reagan expressed his support for states' rights at the Neshoba County Fair in Mississippi during the election in 1980. You can see an image on the bottom left-hand side of this slide. Neshoba County had been the site of the murder of 3 civil rights workers back in 1964 by the KKK. I talked about that in a previous video. And Reagan talked about states' rights, especially when it came to education and community involvement. Carter and critics of Reagan argued that his invocation of the term states' rights in Neshoba County, this was an attempt to support former segregationists, and that it was a tacit endorsement of the murder of those civil rights workers. This is, I think, going too far. Neshoba County was an important speaking venue in Mississippi, and this is a period where the Republican Party is still working to gain control of the Deep South. So Mississippi is still an important place at this point for Republicans to visit for campaigning purposes. Um, Reagan, like Nixon before him, was also accused of racism and so-called dog whistle tactics for his criticism of welfare recipients. And he made these criticisms in the 1970s when he first ran for president in 76 and again in 80. Reagan used language like Cadillac driving welfare queens and strapping young bucks buying T-bone steaks with food stamps. And for years, Reagan had referenced the Linda Taylor case, who you can see on the right-hand side of this slide. Taylor was an African-American woman who had engaged in at least $100,000 worth of welfare fraud in the 1970s. That would be nearly $1 million in today's money, along with other alleged criminal acts. Reagan referenced her case multiple times and frequently exaggerated the amount of money that she had embezzled. And Carter and Reagan's opponents, they would claim that Reagan continuously talked about Taylor and welfare fraud because he was a racist, and that he was trying to court racist voters. Reagan's conservative defenders, though, argued that Reagan attacked welfare because he saw it as a big government program that could be very easily abused, and that racism was not what inspired his criticism. And Reagan declared that he was not a racist and he wanted to help black people, especially those living in inner cities. And Reagan actually, a Californian, a former actor, he also insinuated that Carter, a white man from the South, was racist. As a way to deflect comments that were made against himself. But generally speaking, Reagan ran a more positive campaign, focusing on what he would do if he were president rather than attacking his opponent. And we actually know a lot about Reagan's inner thoughts and beliefs because he kept a very extensive diary during his presidency, and his diary was actually published after his death. People also discuss Reagan's shift to the right politically. They point out aging. They point out becoming more religious as time went on. Reagan himself said it was because he felt that the Democratic Party had moved too far to the left. Some people point to his wife, really his second wife, Nancy Reagan, that she was a major influence on Reagan's sort of change in many political stances. But here's actually Nancy Reagan, Ronald Reagan, and they're speaking with Reverend Jesse Jackson, an important African American leader. And again, Reagan thought that by fixing the struggling economy, he could help all Americans, especially African Americans who were struggling financially. He did not believe that the government was the best solution for helping poor people and low income and marginalized people. Reagan, who loved to tell little jokes and have little quips and things, used to say, "The most frightening words in the English language are, 'I'm with the government and I'm here to help.'" And now we come to the 1980 election itself. And while Reagan struggled, he had some speaking gaffes, and the press overall was friendlier to Carter than they were to Reagan. Reagan was, criticized for being a Hollywood actor and an intellectual lightweight, and he was even criticized for using cue cards rather than printed notes or a teleprompter for his speeches. He was able to prevail in the end. And by the way, he liked to use cue cards because he was an actor, and that was something he would have been used to coming out of Hollywood. And also, Reagan, although he was often criticized for not being as intellectual or cerebral as Carter. Carter went to the U.S. Naval Academy, which is a very serious academic institution. Reagan had studied economics and sociology in college. He was no slouch either intellectually. Reagan was able to win in the end. And his campaign slogan, this "Make America Great Again" slogan, it would have resonated with many Americans in 1980 who were dealing with a struggling economy, foundering foreign policy, and the so-called malaise that had set out over the nation as a whole. And many political campaigns are going to use this "Make America Great Again" slogan or promise. And the 1980 election is considered to be the first election in the sixth party system in which the Republican Party is going to be strong in the western states and in the southeast, and the Democratic Party is going to be strong in parts of the northeast and west coast. Although if you drill a little deeper and look on the county level, the Democrats are actually still doing pretty well in the South. And Carter does get a couple of southern states. He gets his home state of Georgia, he gets West Virginia, and he gets Maryland as well. Ronald Reagan was inaugurated on January 20th, 1981, the same day that the release of the U.S. hostages was completed. The U.S. had given the Iranian government about 50 tons of gold as payment, and it agreed not to pursue further action against Iranian affairs in the future. And Iran dropped their demand that the U.S. apologize to them in order to get the hostages back. And Iran dropped this and several of the other more humiliating demands that they had come up with because of mounting pressure of the Iran-Iraq war, among other issues. And Carter has been, or was, the primary U.S. hostage negotiator. Reagan, in later years, has been associated with the hostage's return. Some have speculated that Reagan may have tried to sabotage the hostage negotiations in what has often been called an October surprise plan to keep Carter from being reelected. Although evidence for this theory is circumstantial at best. And it's really more of a conspiracy theory. It can be classified alongside people who believe the 1960 election was rigged, or who believe that Bob Woodward was a CIA agent, and that's why he got the Watergate scoop, or who believe that the moon landing was fake. Very, very slim circumstantial evidence. It's often motivated more by partisan reasons. If anything, Reagan's promises of a more aggressive and militant U.S. foreign policy probably hurried along the hostage negotiations, because the Iranians knew that they were going to be dealing with a more militant and aggressive president in the future, and it was better to negotiate with Carter and get things resolved than to wait and have to deal with Reagan instead. Reagan's presidency started off on a very positive note with the liberation of the American hostages. Although some would argue that some of his momentum was slowed down by the attempted assassination that he survived. On March 30th, 1981, a young man named John Hinckley Jr. Attempted to assassinate President Reagan in Washington, D.C. He used a six-shot 22 caliber revolver, a very small gun, and he struck the president with a bullet. The bullet actually ricocheted off the presidential limousine and struck Reagan in the chest area, actually puncturing his lung. And two others were hit by bullets as well. And John Hinckley Jr.'s motives were not political, unlike other previous presidential assassins who had various political beliefs that motivated their decision to try to kill a president. Hinckley was motivated by mental illness, we would say. He believed that if he assassinated a famous person, then actress Jodie Foster would fall in love with him and want to be with him. Clearly a man who was very mentally ill. I should say that the more political assassins that we've dealt with in American history, they showed signs of mental illness too. John Wilkes Booth, Lee Harvey Oswald, and others. But Hinckley did not kill the president. He only attempted to murder the president. And he was eventually actually found not guilty by reason of insanity. And he was actually released from his imprisonment in 2016. And when I say imprisonment, he was really more in locked up psychiatric care. He actually eventually became a guitar player, and I think it was in 2023 he actually did a sold out concert in New York City. Who wouldn't want to see a presidential assassin play guitar? Anyway, Reagan was taken to the hospital. The doctors prepared to operate on him to remove the bullets and save his life. And Reagan liked to make jokes and little quips and things like that. That was part of his style. And famously, he leaned over to the surgeon that was preparing to put him under, or I guess the anesthesiologist that was preparing to put him under. And he said, "Doctor, are there any Democrats in this operating room?" And the doctor responded by saying, "Mr. President, today we're all Republicans." So the attempted assassination of Reagan, while it was a significant moment, and some might say it took momentum and wind out of Reagan's sails, it did actually build a lot of goodwill for the president. And we see this with attempted assassinations even of presidents in more recent years as well. So after Reagan survived his assassination attempt, he began to implement his domestic political agenda, particularly his economic agenda, which is often known as Reaganomics. And essentially, Reaganomics was a form of supply-side economics, meaning that if you stimulated supply, that is, you increased the supply of goods and services, you could fight inflation by lowering the price of things, and that would be good for the economy. And initially, there were a lot of struggles with Reaganomics. Reagan becomes president in January of 1981, and you can see that we still have negative GDP growth into 1981, into 1982, and it's really not until 1983 that you start to see consistently positive GDP growth. And this type of supply side economics, where you lower taxes and lower regulations and cut domestic government spending, it is often associated with Reagan. But these ideas that if you cut taxes, you can make a more dynamic economy and you can increase spending in certain areas. In the 1960s, they did this by increasing domestic spending. In the 80s, they did it by increasing foreign policy and defense spending and things like that. This idea is actually not unique to Reagan. It came around in the 1960s with JFK. So people often associate this type of supply side economics with Reagan, but it had been going for a couple of decades before the 1980s. And it's part of the trend of neoliberalism in American economics and politics. People often point to Reagan and they point to the 80s, but neoliberalism really had been cooking for decades before the 1980s. You might even push neoliberalism back as far as the 1947 Taft-Hartley Act, which really decreased the power of unions in America. Neoliberal economics is about using supply-side economics, global trade, and a more deregulated economy to try to spur economic growth, rather than focusing on demand or on worker protections and things like that. And while taxes were lowered, and while the economy did grow more rapidly and it reached over 5% GDP growth per year, you do have an increasing national debt that happens in the 1980s. Although the really big jumps in the U.S. national debt, they really occur in the 2000s. Here are some other useful stats to know about supply side economics, about Reaganomics. Again, it is a form of supply side economics, meaning that you stimulate the supply, increase the goods and services, and by doing so the prices will lower and inflation will be dealt with. And you will lower taxes to encourage investment. That is the idea as well, that if taxes are lowered, there's more money to build businesses and there's more money for consumption of goods. And there is negative GDP growth in the first couple of years of Reagan's term, but by 1983 things begin to turn around and you get more closer to a 3.4% average annual GDP growth during Reagan's first term, which is considered to be good GDP growth. Basically, you need to have at least 2% GDP growth per year in order to have a healthy economy. That's generally what economists would say. And inflation does slow down during this period. It slows from 12%, a very high inflation rate, a lot like what we saw in the early 2020s, if you want to put it into perspective for contemporary times, down to a more manageable 4%. Again, though, the goal for inflation is actually to keep it at more like 2%. 2% inflation, 2% GDP growth. You don't want anything higher than 2% on inflation usually, and you really want to have at least 2% GDP growth per year. As I said before, the national debt really does increase though in the 1980s. And the big jump, though, of course, is in the 2000s. Lower taxes, but increased defense spending, even as domestic spending, particularly on government welfare and social programs, were cut. And people often point out with Reaganomics that Reaganomics tended to help middle class and wealthier classes the most because it made consumer goods cheaper, it made business investment, it made creation of businesses easier, and believe it or not, industrial jobs actually went up in the 1980s. The number of industrial jobs increased, even though this is the era of neoliberalism, of offshoring. It's just this was a more favorable business and climate, so you actually do have some increases in industrial jobs. It's just other sectors of the economy were increasing. So you can see how it would help middle class people, and you can see how it would help wealthier people. Critics of Reaganomics will say that low-income, marginalized, poor people are not helped by Reaganomics, and that working class people are not helped by Reaganomics as much. They may gain some benefits because inflation will slow down and GDP will increase, meaning more jobs will be available, but they will receive less public assistance as many of these programs were cut in the 1980s and even in later decades. And I would argue, and some historians and economists would agree with me, that the changes that were made to the American welfare and social systems, they actually, in some ways, you might say, um, disincentivized work, for example, and disincentivized families working together to help their children. Because in order to qualify for these programs now, as a cost-saving measure, people who were actually doing somewhat better in advancing themselves socially could no longer receive these government handouts or hand-ups, you might call them. So in some ways, you could argue that poor people were also hurt by the Reaganomics welfare and social service cuts and restructurings. And also for working class people, unions, they become weaker. And this is a trend, though, of course, that has been going on long before the 1980s. It goes back all the way to the 1940s to Taft-Hartley. Many people often point to the aircraft or air traffic controllers strike that took place during the Reagan presidency. In the summer of 1981, air traffic controllers walked off the job to protest for higher wages and for better equipment and working conditions. And President Reagan, gave them 48 hours to return to work, or he was going to fire them and have the military brought in to offer air traffic control to aircraft to keep the economy going. It's really, in some ways, very Teddy Roosevelt-esque. Roosevelt did something similar. He threatened to bring in the military to work in coal mines at the turn of the century. Granted, Teddy Roosevelt was more on the side of unions and on workers, whereas you might argue that Reagan was more on the side of the economy and of trying to get the economy going. But again, this was part of the general weakening of unions that Reagan did support. But again, other politicians for decades before him had supported the weakening of organized labor in America. Now we'll talk about the war on drugs, which it did intensify during the Reagan administration, but the war on drugs intensified across the 20th century. There were very significant drug regulations in the progressive era in the early 1900s, which were pushed by social reform-minded progressives who wanted to make medicines and make foods safer and to make them less addictive. And this legislation increased the scheduling of drugs, particularly of marijuana, that began during the Nixon administration in the 1970s. And you're going to see, in many ways, the intensification of the war on drugs in the 80s. And the focus in the 80s is not going to be on marijuana or LSD, drugs that were popular during the 60s and 70s associated with the counterculture movement. But there was a lot of concern about cocaine in the 1980s. Particularly one type of cocaine called crack cocaine. And cocaine use, particularly crack use, increased dramatically in the 1980s and really into the 1990s. And there was concern that this would be very damaging for inner cities, where drug use was more common, and particularly in minority communities, especially African American communities. Believe it or not, the war on drugs, in many ways in the 1980s and earlier, was actually supported by African Americans, particularly religious African Americans who were concerned about these drugs being trafficked into their communities, often by white drug dealers, and that their children were being hooked on drugs and that their communities were being destroyed. Now, African American support for the war on drugs has decreased with time. But this was a important pet program of the First Lady, Nancy Reagan. Over time, First Ladies have gotten to be more political and have gotten to be more politically active in time, supporting various causes. And Just Say No was an important part of Nancy Reagan's sort of political influence. You might even call it a political agenda. Critics, though, of the crack epidemic, as it was called, and of the war on drugs often point out the harsher sentences that were levied on users and dealers of crack versus powdered cocaine. They suggested that crack was more popular with African Americans, and that was why the sentences were longer and why there was more enforcement of crack laws versus powder cocaine laws, which they said was more of a white drug. I think in reality, the reason that crack was more intensely penalized was because crack cocaine, the absorption, the high could be achieved much more quickly, and it also wore off a lot more quickly as well. When you look at the imprisoned population, the incarcerated population of Americans, the percentage increases across the 20th century. Some would say this is because of better law enforcement. Others would say it's because America is becoming a more authoritarian carceral state. It's what some of the anti-prison activists would say. And you'll notice that in the 60s and 70s, the incarcerated population does increase. Sometimes criminal justice scientists and demographers suggest it's not just about changes to drug laws, but just the fact that in the 60s, the baby boomers are becoming young adults. You know, most crime is committed by young adults, primarily by young men, and having a young adult population, a large young adult population, just means you're going to have more people in prison because there's going to be more crime. And people often point to an increase in the imprisoned population during the 1980s with the crack epidemic, so-called, but really the big jump in the imprisoned population is actually in the 90s and 2000s. It's not during the 80s with the Reagan administration. And I'll talk about why the imprisoned population jumps substantially in the 1990s. And related to the so-called crack epidemic was the increased knowledge about HIV or AIDS. The AIDS virus, the HIV, human autoimmune deficiency virus. This virus had been around for many years before the 1980s, but the first recognized cases were coming out in 1980, 1981, certainly by 1982. And there was a lot of fear and concern about HIV. They had certain ideas about the virus that were correct, that this virus would eventually kill you by destroying your body's immune system, but they had incorrect ideas about the transmission of the virus. They believed that it was not just a sexually transmitted illness or an illness transmitted by blood and certain bodily fluids. They believed it could possibly be transmitted through the air, like a flu virus, for example. They also believed that it was a disease associated with homosexual people, particularly with gay men. And this is because the first documented cases of the virus were in the gay community, in the gay male community. And some people called it GRID, the gay-related immune disease or gay-related immune disorder. And others even more callously called it the gay disease. And it's been suggested that the Reagan administration did not do enough to deal with HIV/AIDS because it was associated with gay people. And there's always criticisms of public health policies, but I also want to say that there was serious concern and fear that this virus could mutate and eventually become something that would not be sexually transmitted. So I don't think people were nearly as dismissive of AIDS as some people would like to say. I think it was a new disease that was not well documented, and policymakers, physicians, public health experts were basically kind of making things up as they went along, which we certainly know about that in the 2020s. And one last point I'll make about HIV/AIDS is that AIDS is not a cure for HIV. We haven't developed a vaccine for it. People occasionally will say that they've developed something like a vaccine. What we have now are medications which will keep your viral load very, very low to the point where you basically will not be, your immune system will not be destroyed by the HIV virus, and you will not be able to transmit the virus. So it's not cured, but it's much better treated now in the 2020s. But fear over HIV, it does in many ways lead to an end to the sexual revolution that took place in the 60s. Although in some ways the sexual revolution began before the 60s and went into the 1970s, because now you have a sexually transmitted illness that cannot be easily cured with antibiotics. So people become more concerned about sex and sexuality in the 1980s. More so than they were in the 1970s and 1960s. Now we'll turn our attention beyond U.S. borders, and we're going to talk about Reagan's foreign policy, especially during his first term. And as part of taking a more aggressive stance against the USSR and against communism, Reagan referred to the Soviet Union as the evil empire in 1983. He condemned the Soviets not only for their anti-democratic policies and human rights abuses, but for their communist ideology as well. And the evil empire speech and its condemnation of the Soviet Union and communism would come to be known as the Reagan Doctrine. And it would be part of the rollback policy against the Soviet Union. The rollback policy it's different than the Truman Doctrine of containment. It's certainly different than the détente that was supported by Nixon and by Carter and Ford, Ford being between Nixon and Carter. It's more like what Eisenhower was attempting to do when Eisenhower was president, and even what Kennedy, I think, was attempting to do for the couple of years that he was briefly president. It's a much more militant and aggressive foreign policy vis-a-vis the Soviet Union. And basically, the rollback means we're going not only to contain the Soviet Union, but we're ultimately trying to dissolve the Soviet Union and defeat communism. And to this end, the Reagan administration will support anti-Soviet and anti-communist resistance movements across the world. Most notably, Reagan will continue his support of the Mujahideen insurgents who resisted the Soviet occupation of Afghanistan. And the idea is the Mujahideen, they may not be, Western democratic people, but they are fighting against the Soviet Union. And this was a policy that Carter began, but Reagan continued it. And critics of Reagan, particularly more conservative people who criticize Reagan, often say that Reagan supported the Mujahideen, which probably seemed like the right thing to do at the time. He even had them come to the Oval Office in 1983, as you can see on the center of this slide, that he didn't understand the dangers of radical Islam. And by the way, when I say radical Islam, I mean radical Islam. I mean politicized, often very fundamentalist strains of Islam. I don't mean everyday Muslim people. And there's a lot of variety within the Islamic religion. There's different sects, there's different ethnic groups, just as there's a lot of variety within Christianity, for example. Closer to the United States, Reagan will also support anti-communist insurgencies in Latin America, including what were called the Contras in Nicaragua, which we'll talk more about the Contras later on. But we shift from supporting right-wing authoritarian governments in Latin America, as we had done in the 70s with Operation Condor. We tend to move more towards supporting insurgencies instead, insurgents like the Contras, and then even in some cases more directly challenging communist forces in Latin America, which I'm going to get to in a moment. Speaking of Caribbean and Latin American interventions by the United States in the 1980s, we have the U.S. invasion of Grenada, which is often known as Operation Urgent Fury. And in 1979, the left-leaning, arguably communist government of Grenada fell to a even more radical and even more authoritarian communist government. So we go from one left-wing government that's democratically elected to one that is not democratically elected, that takes over violently. And this is a problem for two reasons. The first reason is there are American expats living in Grenada. They go there for medical school and for veterinary school, and they could have been in danger from this authoritarian government. It's also a problem because the new communist government is getting to be closer with other communist nations, most notably East Germany, North Korea, and Cuba, and the USSR as well. And this is a major problem. Grenada is a very strategically located island in the Eastern Caribbean. Castro and the communist Cubans could potentially use Grenada as a stopover point for their operations in Africa. Fidel Castro in Cuba had very aggressive foreign policy as well. He supported communist movements throughout the Americas. He also supported communist movements in sub-Saharan Africa as well. So this Operation Urgent Fury is being done to protect American lives, but also it's being done in the context of the Cold War as well. And Reagan justified this invasion by arguing that weakness in Grenada could lead to increased communist gains across Latin America. It could embolden Cuba. It could embolden the Soviet Union. and we need to protect democracy. We need to remove authoritarian states, and we need to protect our own citizens as well. But there's a lot of concern about this operation because 10 years earlier in 1973, the United States was leaving the conflict in Vietnam, and there's a real palpable fear for people in the 1980s that this Grenadian intervention could turn into another Vietnam. But the invasion was a success, and the U.S. and other Caribbean nations quickly and easily defeated the communist government in Grenada. In many ways, the United States military is rebuilding itself, both militarily and logistically, and in terms of reputation, in the 1980s after everything that happened in Vietnam. And Operation Urgent Fury was a success. It's a morale booster for the U.S. military, and it's a confidence booster for American civilians at home. There are areas that are more contentious, though, in Reagan's first term when it comes to foreign policy. Reagan had sent U.S. troops on an international peacekeeping force to Lebanon during the Lebanese Civil War. During the intervention, U.S. Marines at their barracks in Beirut, they were attacked by a suicide bomber, and about 241 Americans were killed. In retaliation, the Reagan administration ordered the USS New Jersey, you can see on the left-hand side of the slide, to bombard Syrian positions in Lebanon. And then Reagan will withdraw the Marines from the country to limit American casualties, because that was a major problem in the Vietnam War, were the American casualties. And the reason the Syrians were in Lebanon was because Lebanon was experiencing a civil war during this period. And that's going to be important later, the unrest in Lebanon. In 1983, Reagan also proposed the Strategic Defense Initiative, or SDI, which called for ground and space-based technologies to shoot down potential Soviet ballistic missile launches. Remember, in the 1970s, the Soviets did not focus so much on building more nuclear missiles as they focused on building faster and more sophisticated silo-busting missiles. And now in the 80s, the United States is focusing on building space-based technologies that can shoot down Soviet missiles. And the idea is if we can shoot down Soviet missiles and intercept their missiles, then we can then launch our own missiles at the Soviets without consequences. And the SDI included using satellites and reflecting technologies, and even things like lasers. And these, to many people, sound like science fiction type technologies, but this technology did exist. It was just highly experimental, and not to mention highly expensive. But that was actually kind of the point, though. The idea is we were trying to show the Soviet Union that our economy was stronger and more dynamic. Free market capitalism was stronger than Soviet command economy communism, and that we could afford complicated and experimental defense projects in a way that they simply could not. And the Soviet Union really, by the 1980s, was in decline. Economically, socially, and militarily. And Reagan is increasing the pressure now. He's not using détente the way previous administrations had. And this was very alarming to the Soviets, who didn't feel like they could keep up. And also, scholars, particularly scholars who do work in technology and economics, they also talk about how the Soviets were not technophobic, but in many ways they become very ossified by the 1980s. And they were very suspicious of computers in particular. And in order to make something like the SDI work, you need to have very sophisticated computer knowledge. And the Soviets just were too reticent to embrace computers. And that also plays a role in their declining foreign policy, and in some ways in the collapse of their entire empire. But domestic critics of the SDI, they derisively called it Star Wars. They said it was too expensive, that it was taking away money from social programs. Social program spending was cut by about 60% during this period, and that we were wasting money on foreign policy when there were Americans at home who were struggling. This is a retort that has been given for decades in Cold War American history. But I actually think calling the SDI Star Wars was a kind of a backfire for Reagan's critics because, Star Wars, people think it's science fiction. I think Star Wars is actually fantasy anyway, but the idea is Star Wars was actually a very popular movie in the 1970s and 1980s. The first one came out in 77, the second one came out in 80, and the last one came out in 83. So calling it Star Wars is only going to make everyday Americans like the SDI even more. It's kind of like actually when Al Smith, a opponent of FDR, called the New Deal alphabet soup. That probably actually made Americans like the New Deal better. Calling the SDI Star Wars is going to make it a more interesting and exciting program to everyday Americans. In 1984, America has another presidential election. And despite the criticism that Reagan received for his economic plan and for stepping up the drug war and for, you might say, intensifying the Cold War, Reagan ran for president in 84 with a very strong mandate. He could point to the ongoing economic recovery. He could point to U.S. Athletes' success in the 1984 LA Olympics. Remember, his predecessor, Jimmy Carter, had pulled American athletes out of the 1980 Moscow Olympics to protest the Soviet-Afghan war. There's a lot of patriotic and you might say nationalistic sentiment in the 1984 leading up to the election. That's going to play to Reagan's strength. And Reagan's political campaign message was, "It's morning again in America." It's a very positive campaign slogan. Reagan's going to run against Walter Mondale. He was a Democratic Party politician from Minnesota, and he was former President Jimmy Carter's VP. And he had a strong record on civil rights in particular. And Reagan struggled in his first televised debate, where he appeared confused and beleaguered. He was considerably older than Mondale was. And actually, he was the oldest man elected to be president at that time in American history. He was 74 years old during the 1984 election, which would make him young compared to presidents today in 2025. But Reagan did better in later debates, and he was even able to make light about his age and how age brought him experience and how he was much more experienced than his opponent, Walter Mondale. And Reagan runs on the economic growth the country has experienced in the 1980s. He can run on the foreign policy successes that he's had as well. And Mondale runs on a more liberal platform, promising to kind of bring back some of the liberal policies of the 60s and 70s. Reagan will keep George H.W. Bush, or George Bush Sr., as his incumbent VP. And for his running mate, Walter Mondale will choose Geraldine Ferraro, a Democratic Party representative from New York, as his VP. Ferraro was actually the first female vice presidential candidate from any major political party in the U.S. And they often brought up Ferraro in criticisms of Mondale. They called Walter F. Mondale, they called him Fritz, and they called Ferraro, an unkind word for female anatomy that rhymes with Fritz, which I'm not going to say on YouTube, but you can figure it out. And Reagan wins resoundingly in the 84 election. He gets nearly 59% of the popular vote, and he gets 49 of the 50 states in the electoral vote. It's a landslide. Mondale only gets his home state of Minnesota. And Reagan's overwhelming victory in the South, the Midwest, and the Northeast has been credited to groups of people like the Reagan Democrats. These are people that were white working class people that maybe voted for Nixon in 72, but then voted for Carter in 76, and now they're voting for Reagan, a Republican, in the 1980s. Also, white Southerners are overwhelmingly voting for the Republican Party now. If you look at the county level maps in the South, the only areas that are voting for the Democratic Party in the South at this point are areas that are strongly African American, in areas like the Black Belt, for example, which you can see here. The sixth party system, it gets going in about 1980, but it's really in full swing by 1984. So who's helping Reagan win elections in 1980 and in 1984? I've mentioned the so-called Democrats for Reagan, blue-collar white people throughout the country that may have voted Democrat in the past, part of the New Deal coalition. They're now voting Republican because the Republican Party aligns with them more on social issues, if not on economic ones. So you have blue-collar workers, you have white evangelicals of the rising religious right. Sometimes that group is actually called the moral majority, and they really vote based on evangelical Christian moral principles, and they really believe that they have to vote their values politically. You also could point to young people as well, the so-called Reagan generation. And these were Generation X people, Gen Xers, who in 1984, they voted in their first election. They would have been too young to vote in 1980. And the youth vote will go to Ronald Reagan in 1984. And I've talked to people who were young in 84 who they voted in their first election, some of these older Gen Xers. And I asked them, Reagan versus Mondale, why did you vote for Reagan? And, generally they didn't get into the issues as much, but they would say, Reagan was already a president. He was the incumbent. He survived an assassination attempt. He was our president. We liked him and we voted for him. Others said, well, Reagan was in favor of lower taxes. He was pro-business. And we as Gen Xers, we wanted to get into our careers. We wanted to make money. So we voted for Reagan rather than for Mondale in 1984. And a lot of these people would have voted Democrat in the past, particularly white evangelicals in the South. They would have been a lock for the Democrats before the 1960s. Blue-collar workers would have been more in the Democratic New Deal coalition, but now those groups are voting for the Republican Party because of economic and social factors. And then young people are voting for Reagan in 1984. And these trends, they don't come out of nowhere. People actually had predicted some of this stuff for many years before the 1984 election. There's a well-known book called Kevin Phillips, The Emerging Republican Majority. It came out way back in 1969, and Kevin Phillips was a Nixon staffer. He predicted that the Republican Party and conservatism would become a dominant force in American politics in the coming decades, in the 1970s and 1980s, because of demographic changes, because of the growth of what was called the Sun Belt. He actually was the one who used the Sun Belt. The Sun Belt being a reference to parts of the Southeast, parts of the Southwest, even parts of California, where there were a lot of people moving after World War II for jobs in the defense industry, jobs in tech, even in military service. Those areas were very strategically significant, and there were a lot of conservative people moving there for defense and military reasons, and that they were going to be solid Republican conservative voters in future decades. And in some ways, this Sun Belt group of people, which also includes a lot of suburban voters as well, the growth of cities, the growth of suburbs in that part of the country is also going to strengthen the Republican Party's hand. And this Sun Belt migration, this emerging Republican majority, it's going to be pretty strong through the 1980s and in some ways into the 1990s and early 2000s as well. Before moving on to our discussion of Reagan's second term as president, I want to unpack the term the Sun Belt a little bit more. And I talked about this a bit on a previous slide, but I wanted to include some more information as well as a map. The term Sun Belt was used by Kevin Phillips in his 1969 piece, The Emerging Republican Majority, as mentioned before. And as I mentioned before, the region also grew economically thanks to military and defense projects during the Cold War era, as well as right-to-work laws that led to increased industrialization in the region as businesses and factories could operate more cheaply in these southeastern and southwestern states because unions would not be as powerful in the South, East, and Southwest because of the Taft-Hartley Act of 1947, which allowed these states to pass right-to-work laws, meaning that you don't have to join a union to work at a certain place of business. There's another factor that I also wanted to mention, and this is the expansion of air conditioning. Scientists and engineers had experimented with ice-making technology in the 1800s, and in 1902, Willis Carrier, an engineer from the Northeast, he developed the first real modern air conditioning unit that could cool the air. Of course, these early units were the size of a house, and they were very, very expensive. It's not until the 1920s that you start to see commercial air conditioning in government buildings and in movie theaters and in the lobbies of hotels. The rooms were often still very, very sweltering, and you'd have to cool off using, ice from an ice bucket. You actually see this in The Great Gatsby, of all things. The technology, though, continues to get smaller and continues to get cheaper and more efficient, particularly after World War II. And the development of cheaper and more efficient and powerful air conditioning units that can be placed in windows and in cut into walls and things like that allows for homes to be cooled, much to the delight of wives and mothers who are at home working in the heater on the house while their husbands are at the office working where there is air conditioning, where air conditioning was in public buildings before it was in homes. I should also add, though, that even in the 1950s and 1960s, air conditioning was still quite a bit more expensive. A window unit like what you're seeing on the slide really basically cost about what a central unit would cost today, to give you a perspective. But as time goes on, as I said, this trend of efficiency increases, and actually by the 1980s, the majority of Americans have access to air conditioning in their homes, and that number will increase after the 1980s, and it fits right along with the Sun Belt migration as people are moving into the South and into the Southeast, the Southwest for jobs in the U.S. government, with the U.S. military, with defense and research, with the oil and gas industry, with factories that are emerging in the region. The economy of this part of the country changes. It becomes a lot less about agriculture and much more about industry and research and technology. And in some ways, government jobs. William Faulkner, the very famous Southern author, bemoaned that the industry of the South, he's talking about the Southeast primarily, was no longer agriculture. The industry was the U.S. federal government, which is a bit ironic because that was a part of the country that had a lot of anti-federal government sentiment going back to even before the U.S. Civil War. And people used to joke about air conditioning. They used to say that General Electric had conquered the South far more thoroughly than General Sherman ever could. And while I don't want to be a technological determinist and say that human decisions and human choice are determined exclusively by technology, air conditioning was a very significant invention, and people often overlook how important it was in really changing the way people related to their homes and related to the environment. It really changed what made an area desirable to live in. Now people wanted to be in areas that had hot summers because that meant there would be milder, easier to deal with winters. Think about the kind of person that might have come to a place like Florida at the turn of the century. Perhaps they were coming here for vacations, to get out of the cold winter weather, but they would be more likely to want to be a snowbird, to leave the state once things start to get warm in the spring and summer. But now you can live in Florida year round. And the same is true of other Sunbelt states, places like New Mexico, Arizona, Texas. They get to be very, very warm in the summer. And so the Sunbelt will grow really rapidly, both from immigration into the United States from places like Mexico and the Caribbean and Asia, particularly on the Pacific coast. But it's also going to grow from intra-state migration. There are people moving within these states and within the region, and then there's interstate migration. Interstate meaning someone moving from, say, New York or Ohio to Florida or Georgia. And depending on how you define the Sun Belt, this is a map from Business Insider using Census Bureau data, and I think it's a pretty reasonable map of the Sun Belt. Depending on how you define the Sun Belt, you're going to find that by the mid-2000s, at the earliest, the Sun Belt is going to be the most populous region of the United States. It's going to outpace the Northeast and the Midwest and the Great Plains regions. as well as the Intermountain West and Pacific Northwest. There's just going to be a lot more people living in the big cities of the Southeast and of the Southwest, which includes areas that are very developed, like Southern California, parts of Eastern Texas, the big cities of Florida, and places like the Atlanta metro in Georgia. And Sunbelt politics, in many ways, are going to dominate American politics, particularly American conservative politics in the 1980s and the 1990s and beyond. Before we go on to discuss the second term of the Reagan presidency, I also want to go over one more demographic trend. I discussed the Sunbelt migration and the increase in the Sunbelt population on the previous slide, and I've already alluded to this before, but the maturation of Generation X in the 1980s also did play a part in the Reagan presidency, the Reagan Revolution, particularly the 1984 election. And I just want to talk a bit about Gen X. They were born starting around 1965, and they're born into the early 1980s. Some will say about 1982 or so, but again, you'll get slightly different dates depending on which demographers and which data sources you consider. And Generation X, they're the first generation to have both parents working outside of home. That is, the majority of American families in the 1970s began to be dual income families. And so these children, they would have spent their formative years with both parents going to work. Not necessarily both parents being full-time workers, but both parents working at least part-time, perhaps the father working full-time and the mother working part-time. That was definitely the experience for my father's family. My father actually technically is a boomer. He was born in '64, but really he thinks and acts a lot more like a Gen Xer, and he does not like being called a boomer. It really, really upsets him. It's also interesting too, older generations, they're much more likely to identify with the generation they're a part of, either the boomer generation or the X generation. Even though my dad, as I said, identifies with Gen X, even though he really, demographically speaking, is a boomer. So they come of age with both parents working outside of the home. They are what is called the latchkey kids. They will go off to school. They get themselves ready to go to school in the morning. They ride the bus home. They ride their bike home. They have a set of house keys to get into the house. The latchkey kids is what they're called. And previous generations, the kids might not have had a set of keys. They might have just opened up an unlocked door. But crime rates had increased since the 1960s, so you had to lock your house behind you. There was a realization that the America was a more dangerous place from the 1960s on. Also, Gen X would have witnessed a higher divorce rate as well amongst their parents, and this was a product of the sexual revolution. It's a product of declining religious service attendance and civic and community engagement. And it's also, I think, a combination of the stress of both parents working outside of the home. Work inside of the home is hard. Women have always worked, but in some ways, when you're working inside of the home, you are your own boss. You don't have to worry about managers. You don't have to worry about other employees or customers doing crazy things. Also, the Gen X children, before they became adults, the older ones would have witnessed things like the Watergate scandal, the Carter presidency, the Iranian hostages in the 1970s, and those experiences would have stuck with them into the 1980s. There would have been a fierce independent streak and an anti-authoritarian streak, and you really see this in Generation X's interest in extreme sports. I've included some very famous Gen X extreme sports athletes, people like Tony Hawk at center, Kelly Slater. This is when he was very young at the top left, and it also would have impacted their music choice as well. Some Gen Xers might have listened to Huey Lewis in the news and thought, hey, it's hip to be square, it's hip to be cool. But other Gen Xers also would have liked the music of Kurt Cobain, which was more on the alternative side and a bit more openly anti-authoritarian. And as I said, this was a period in which safety concerns were becoming more salient as a result of rising crime rates. This is also when we have the first regularly enforced, nationally enforced car seat laws and seatbelt laws. I mean, these laws are being done on a state-by-state level, but by 1985, the majority, or rather the 50 states, all have seatbelt laws, and there are child restraint laws as well, which do lead to a drastic decrease in childhood auto accident, auto collision fatalities. But it does lead to people driving bigger, less fuel efficient SUVs and minivans because now they have to fit car seats in. They've got to make sure that every passenger has their own seat belt. You can't just throw 7 kids in the back of a station wagon as would have been done in the 1960s and 1970s. This is a change that Gen Xers would have witnessed in their own lifetime. And it's a cliche, it's a meme at this point, but Gen Xers and some younger boomers too will joke about how they didn't wear bike helmets when they rode their bikes to school. They stayed outside all day until the street lamps came on. They didn't even come inside to drink water. They would drink from the garden hose. These things happened, in this period. And early on with the boomers is because it was a high trust society, and you weren't supposed to be too guarded, because if you were guarded, you might be hiding something like being a communist sympathizer or something along that line. But with Gen X, they were out till late because both of their parents were working, and they had to be. They were the latchkey kids. And the way they were parented is, I think, quite different than how the millennial generation and Generation Z were parented, where they were dealing with helicopter parenting, parents who, in some ways, could not let go of their children, even though they were also working dual incomes. And I think increased parenting pressures, what's often called safetyism, still being on a dual income, economic family household structure, it also will lead to declining birth rates. As it's harder to have as many children. Each child requires a lot more work to ensure that they're safe and to ensure they're having everything they need to be everything that it's believed they need to be a healthy, successful, well-adjusted adult. I should also add that there are some people who estimate that seatbelt and child booster seat and car seat laws also contributed to declining birth rates as well, as it simply got to be more expensive to have more kids because you have to have a bigger car. But there's been some really interesting scholarship and papers of late about this subject, so it's still very new and very debatable, this line of thinking. So we talked about the Reagan Revolution, the 1984 election, the Reagan generation, the Gen X voters. We talked about the Reagan Democrats and the Sun Belt. Now we'll turn back to foreign policy, but we're going to focus on Reagan's second term now. And during his second term, he will continue to put pressure on the Soviet Union. He will continue to support the increased defense spending as well as the expansion of the SDI. And there's shakeups in Soviet leadership as well that happened in the 1980s, particularly in 1985. Mikhail Gorbachev becomes the premier or dictator of the Soviet Union. And a series of factors that weakened the Soviet Union in the 1970s and 1980s, leading to changes in the rise of people like Mikhail Gorbachev. Collective agriculture and manufacturing meant that the Soviet Union was just not as responsive to a changing world as the United States was, which had profit motives and free enterprise. The American economic system is not centrally managed, it's decentralized, so individuals can recognize the winds of change often much more quickly and easily than a ossified bureaucracy can. And as I said, the Soviet Union, their government really became very, very bureaucratic and very ossified in the 80s, particularly when it came to computers. Additionally, oil prices fell significantly, especially after 1985. The falling of oil prices is going to be disastrous for the Soviet Union because oil was one of the Soviet Union's most important exports and is what kind of kept their economy funded. And the ongoing Soviet-Afghan war proved expensive and bloody for the USSR, and it provokes really great social unrest within the Soviet Union, a lot like what happens stateside in the U.S. with the Vietnam War back in the 60s and early 70s. And the U.S. will exploit the Soviet-Afghan War the way the Soviet Union exploited the U.S.-Vietnam War. I've studied the Soviet-Afghan War, and there was a lot of resistance to Soviet military conscription. There were protests and things like that. Not as aggressive as you would see in the United States, because the Soviet Union was not a free democratic society with freedom of expression and a First Amendment. The Soviet government actually tried to keep the Soviet war under wraps. They misled the Soviet people about why their sons were being sent to Afghanistan. They told them they were there on humanitarian missions to build bridges and to build roads, but they were there fighting Afghan insurgents and establishing a communist puppet government in the country. And families, their sons would die in Afghanistan, and they would be placed in zinc coffins. They'd be welded shut. That way, the families couldn't see that their sons had been killed by bullets, and they would say, "Oh, well, we've welded your son's body shut in a coffin because he died of malaria and it's contagious." But really, the Soviet people knew what was up. They knew that their Zinky boys, as they were called, were not killed by malaria. They were killed by Afghan insurgents. And to make matters even worse, in some cases, young Russian Soviet communist soldiers, they got their first taste of capitalism and of free enterprise in Afghanistan. They went to Afghanistan and they could buy Levi's blue jeans. They could buy French cosmetics. They not for their own use, but for their girlfriends or for their wives or for their mothers back home, or even Adidas tracksuits. There's a meme that Russians love Adidas tracksuits. It's one, because of the 1980 Moscow Olympics. Everybody wanted to look like an athlete. But two, it's because of the Soviet-Afghan War, because you'd buy an Adidas tracksuit in Afghanistan from the black market, and then you would send it home. And this was a sign, one, that you were engaging in capitalism, which was taboo and interesting and cool in the communist Soviet Union. But also, two, it was kind of a sign that you were a elite special forces, like you were in the Spetsnaz or in some kind of elite unit where you didn't have to wear military uniforms. You could wear civilian clothing like these tracksuits. So really interesting things happened to the Soviet Union because of the Soviet-Afghan War. I should also point out, too, that when it comes to the draft, non-white Russians, Russians from the Caucasus and from Asian regions, were much more likely to be sent to Afghanistan than white European Russians. The nuclear disaster at Chernobyl in what is now Ukraine in April of 1986 was also a factor. Although fewer than 100 people died in the initial meltdown and in containing the radiation leak, thousands more would die over the next several years from radiation poisoning and other disease. And this would weaken the Soviet state, and it's going to cause the Soviet Union to lose prestige on the international stage. They cannot build effective infrastructure anymore. They cannot manage nuclear power plants, and they cannot effectively clean up the radiation. And also, there are more scenes from the Soviet-Afghan War on this slide as well, including a Russian soldier wearing a Russian military uniform, as well as what looks to be a civilian track jacket. As I said, tracksuits became very popular with Russian soldiers in the Soviet-Afghan War, and they became a kind of a sign that you were of elite status. People often talk about how capitalism is bad for the environment, that it leads to overproduction of goods which get thrown into landfills, that carbon footprints are increased excessively as a result of free market economics. And I'm not saying that that's untrue, but they often gloss over the damage that the communistic authoritarian command economy structure could have on the environment, as well as environmental mitigation often gets skipped over. Infrastructure that's needed to protect environmental resources often is not built properly or maintained properly, as was the case with Chernobyl. But even things like the draining of the Aral Sea. The Aral Sea was one of the largest freshwater lakes in the world. It's in what is now mainly in the country of Uzbekistan, then part of the Soviet Union. The Soviets actually walled off or closed off rivers that floated into the Aral Sea to give it its water. That way they could water their cotton fields. So the destruction of one of the world's largest fresh bodies of water was accomplished by the Soviet Union in the 1950s and 1960s as well. So you have a disastrous war in Afghanistan. You have declining export commodity prices. You have environmental degradation at Chernobyl and at the Aral Sea. The Soviet Union really is beginning to show very clear signs of collapsing in the 1980s. I mean, it was showing signs of decline back in the 70s as well, but those signs were not as obvious to foreign observers. And those signs of decline are really going to be exploited by the Reagan administration in the 1980s. Reagan believed that his pressures on the Soviet Union, as well as the internal pressures the Soviet Union was facing, would make the USSR more open to democracy and free speech, and these measures could lead to independence of the Soviet satellite states, and even possibly the breakup or even the reform of the USSR, what Premier Gorbachev would have called glasnost and perestroika. Glasnost comes from glass mirror, and it means openness or publicity, that there should be increased transparency in the Soviet Union, there should be freedom of information, freedom of speech, and that the people of the Soviet Union and the satellite states ought to be able to make more decisions for themselves and have more self-determination. And perestroika means restructuring, and it's a reference to the famous Russian three-horse chariot, the troika, and that the Soviet political and economic system should be restructured to allow in some elements of free market capitalism, and in some cases even allow satellite states to have self-determination and independence. And Reagan, heard about these glasnost and perestroika overtures, and so he went to Berlin in East Germany. Of course, Berlin had a free Western section, and there in June of 1987, Reagan famously said at the Brandenburg Gate in Berlin, "Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall," a reference to the Berlin Wall, which would eventually be torn down in November of 1989. By that point, Reagan was no longer president. Before I talk about the INF and START treaties, I want to say that there's often a lot of misunderstanding about Mikhail Gorbachev. People often think that Gorbachev was not really communist and that he was trying to destroy the Soviet Union from within. This really isn't true. Gorbachev was a committed communist, and he believed that glasnost and perestroika and having a more cooperative relationship with the United States would actually prolong the Soviet Union and allow it to last longer rather than collapse. This is I would say it's more of a pop cultural misconception. People who've studied a lot more academic history realize that he was a communist, but he believed that communism with some capitalism would be stronger and more able to survive across time. But another common misconception is that Reagan was exclusively just more aggressive with the Soviet Union, and he certainly was on the whole, but he did also sign several very important nuclear disarmament treaties, including the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty, or INF Treaty, and the Strategic Arms Reduction Treaty, or the START Treaty. And many people celebrated, particularly the START Treaty, as it was a cooling off of the potentiality of nuclear war. And this is because Reagan did not really believe in the idea of mutually assured destruction. He thought that by signing these treaties and by working on the SDI, the U.S. could gain the technological edge over the Soviet Union, and there would no longer be as many fears of a nuclear war that would destroy humanity in the future. So the INF and START treaties were disarmament treaties, but they actually were, believe it or not, part of the more aggressive stance he was taking against the Soviet Union. Similar to how in the 1970s, the SALT treaties, the Strategic Arms Limitation treaties, actually benefited the Soviets more than they did the U.S. The INF and START treaties benefit the U.S. more than they do the Soviets. So again, things are turning more in favor of the U.S. in the Cold War in the 1980s, which is a reverse of what was happening in the 70s. But Reagan wasn't just having a more aggressive foreign policy against the Soviet Union. You also see a more aggressive foreign policy in the Middle East as well. In 1986, Reagan's administration launched attacks on Libya, which was at the time ruled by military dictator Muammar Gaddafi. And this was done after a Libyan terrorist attack in Berlin had killed 63 American military personnel. So it was done in retaliation. It was not a preemptive strike. And while many people support Reagan's efforts to roll back the Soviet Union, other foreign policy measures taken by the Reagan administration were much more controversial. And the most notable of these contentious policies was the Iran-Contra scandal, or Iran-Contra affair of 1981 to 1986. In the Iran-Contra affair, the U.S. government planned to sell arms to Iran. This was a violation of its own embargo against the country in exchange for help returning several American hostages that had been kidnapped by a Iran-backed paramilitary organization called Hezbollah that was operating in Lebanon. And some people might consider Hezbollah to be sometimes when you use this word on YouTube, you have problems. Errorist with a T in front of it organization. So the idea is American hostages are in danger through Iranian proxies. If we sell Iran weapons, they can influence Hezbollah to release our people. It's another Iranian hostage situation, essentially, in the 1980s. But this does go against the U.S. embargo, the weapons embargo against Iran. To make things more complicated, though, the proceeds from selling these arms are going to be used to support the Contra rebels of Nicaragua. This is done via the Central Intelligence Agency and through people within the Reagan administration. The Contras were a paramilitary militia that was attempting to overthrow the left-wing Sandinista government of Nicaragua. The Sandinistas had worked to try to mitigate poverty and promote gender equality, but they'd also been criticized for mass executions and human rights abuses, particularly against the Nicaraguan indigenous populations in Nicaragua. And Reagan himself supported the Contras' cause because they were anti-communist. That's part of the Reagan doctrine, but he claimed to have no part in the Iran-Contra scandal. Instead, the actual Iran-Contra deal was handled by people like Oliver North, of the former U.S. Marine Corps officer. He was then with NSC, the National Security Council. Other people like, we believe, Vice President George Bush Sr., who was also a former CIA operative. We believe he was involved. We also believe that people like Dick Cheney and John Bolton may have been involved as well. And I think most likely Reagan did not know about the details of Iran-Contra. And this was probably done for the sake of plausible deniability because they're breaking U.S. embargo regulations. They're dealing with states and armed groups that are enemies of the United States, and also arming the Contras using this scheme. It goes against congressional legislation that was passed that forbade the United States from helping the Contras. So it doesn't seem all that unbelievable for Reagan to have not known exactly the details of what was going on here. But it was, however, definitely a black eye for the foreign policy of the Reagan administration, this Iran-Contra affair and subsequent scandal, which was going on during his first term, but it was fully realized and became public in his second term. And the U.S. Worked to remove the left-wing Sandinistas from power in Nicaragua. The United States was a little bit slower to move against Manuel Noriega, the dictator of Panama. At first, Noriega and the United States had friendly relations. The United States is moving away from Operation Condor in the 1980s. Operation Condor was when the United States supported right-wing authoritarian governments so long as they were anti-communist. But as the 80s go on, we move away from that foreign policy stance. Also, as time went on, Noriega became more hostile to the United States. He talked about attacking the Panama Canal Zone, which would threaten the lives of American citizens who were still in the Canal Zone. Remember, the Carter administration signed over the Canal Zone, the Panama Canal Zone, to Panama, but that transfer was not going to take place until the 1990s. Noriega wanted to move the timeline up, even if that meant endangering U.S. citizens. And he became increasingly erratic and authoritarian as time went on as well. And he was just a very unusual, kind of an odd duck to begin with. There were all these rumors about Noriega that he was very superstitious, that he believed in Santeria, which is a type of almost like Latin American voodoo, that he was very concerned with the evil eye. There were stories that he only wore red underwear for good luck. Very, very strange things like that. People jokingly, people who didn't like him jokingly called him Carapinha, which means pineapple face, because he had scars on his face, as you can see in the right-hand side of this slide. But really just bizarre things like he hated rock music because it was seen as being too countercultural and subversive. He actually tried to ban all guitars from his country. Crazy stuff like that. But as time went on, Noriega wore out his usefulness. He wasn't supporting the United States, he wasn't supporting the Contras, and he was actually threatening the United States and threatening Americans that were in the Canal Zone. So in December of 1989, actually during the presidency of George H.W. Bush, Reagan's former VP, Noriega was going to be removed from power by the U.S. military in what is called Operation Just Cause. And U.S. forces landed in Panama, defeated Noriega's troops fairly quickly and easily without too much resistance from the Panamanian population. And, many Panamanians recognized that Noriega was a erratic and dangerous dictator. And Noriega fled his palace. He actually hid out in the Vatican embassy with U.S. forces outside, basically besieging it. And I have this on information of someone I interviewed who was part of Operation Just Cause. He was a soldier, an air assault soldier in the U.S. Army at the time. And he said that they were outside of the Vatican embassy and they were blasting Van Halen's Panama to try to get Noriega to come out. You might call it a form of psychological torture. I think it's a great song, but Noriega hated rock music, and eventually Noriega was arrested, and he was taken back to the United States, and he was imprisoned at the Chrome Island Detention Center in South Florida, which interesting thing too is while he was in prison at Chrome Island, he actually became a Christian. They did a baptism, but they had to bring in a kid's swimming pool to baptize him. I talked to a religious minister that was worked in that part of the state of Florida, who was a part of that baptismal ritual. Really interesting stories with Noriega. To make things even more interesting, Noriega actually sued Activision, who makes the Call of Duty games, because in Call of Duty Black Ops 2, Noriega is one of the antagonists or villains of the game, and Noriega felt that he was misportrayed by the video game company, and he lost his case actually, because one, he was a authoritarian dictator, and two, in the United States we have the First Amendment, we have freedom of speech. Believe it or not, the Activision in this case was represented by none other than former New York City mayor and very controversial figure Rudy Giuliani. And now we'll talk about Reagan's domestic policy in his second term. In many ways, Reagan continues a lot of his first term policies, Reaganomics and things like that in his second term. The war on drugs will continue to intensify, and he's going to do a lot of things that are going to support his emerging evangelical Christian religious right voter base, who they liked Reagan because they liked his policies, and they also liked Reagan because Reagan was an outspoken religious Christian person. He may not have always lived a Christian life. He was a Hollywood celebrity. He was previously divorced, but as he became more spiritual, as he became more conservative, many conservative religious voters really rallied behind Reagan. They didn't always agree with him, though. For example, back in 1981, which was during Reagan's first term, he had an opening on the Supreme Court, and he said in his diary he planned to nominate the first female justice, the first woman to be justice on the Supreme Court. He chose Sandra Day O'Connor, very qualified politician from Arizona. But many religious right voters who were increasingly a part of Reagan's base, they were very upset with this choice. They even wrote to the president asking him not to nominate her because she was not pro-life enough or anti-abortion enough. She had been kind of a moderate on the issue and had always been kind of evasive of the subject. People asked her, did you support abortion when you were a politician in Arizona? She would say, well, I don't really remember which way I voted. It was so long ago. Interestingly enough, though, as time went on, because she was eventually confirmed by the Senate, Justice O'Connor found herself attacked by evangelical voters for not being against abortion enough, but by more pro-choice or pro-abortion people as well for not being favorable enough towards abortion. But that's Justice O'Connor, who's a very controversial Supreme Court justice who we'll talk about in a future video in more detail. Other issues where Reagan would diverge in some ways from conservatives, particularly conservatives of more recent years. Conservatives post 2010s are on issues related to firearms and gun control, and also some issues related to immigration. On firearms and gun control, Reagan had survived a attempted assassination, and his survival of the attempted assassination and the wounding of some of his retinue, his Secret Service guards, and that led to Reagan being actually more sympathetic to gun control than a lot of conservative politicians would be. For example, he supported the Brady Gun Control Act, which was regulations on handguns. The Brady Act actually came out in the 1990s after Reagan was no longer president, but he did voice support for it. But during his presidency in 1986, the Firearms Owners Protection Act was passed. And this legislation was designed to make selling firearms easier, but it did ban new machine guns or assault rifles from being made and submachine guns from being made. Weapons that had a automatic select fire option, meaning that you could hold the trigger down and they would fire multiple rounds, they were banned after 1986 unless they were made before the 86 ban. So this is one of the most significant pieces of gun control legislation in American history, and well, it made selling guns easier, and it was designed to kind of rein in the power of government agencies like ATF. It did mean an entire class of firearms. Machine guns, whether they are rifles or submachine guns, are now banned. You cannot own one if you are just a regular American civilian, unless you're very, very wealthy and you can purchase one that was made before 1986. So Reagan was not as against gun control as modern 2010s and 2020s conservatives would be. Another area where conservatives of the 2020s and late 2010s would disagree with Reagan was on immigration. For example, Reagan signed the Immigration Control Act of 1986. This was another piece of compromise legislation, kind of like the 1986 Firearm Owners Protection Act. It made it a crime to hire illegal immigrants or undocumented migrants or illegal aliens, whatever term you want to use for people who have entered the country illegally for whatever reason. It was a crime to hire these people. The idea is remove the pull factor of jobs into the country. But the act also granted amnesty to about 3 million people who were illegally residing in the United States, and it set out a pathway to citizenship as well. And that was something that Reagan supported. He felt like it was the right thing to do. These are people who had broken no laws except for their illegal entrance into the country, and the majority of them had lived fine, good lives contributing to the country, and that they should be allowed not only to stay in the U.S., but to eventually become citizens as well. And this is controversial for a variety of reasons, both in the present day and at the time. At the time, illegal immigration was a very controversial issue for many people in the American Southwest, particularly for members of the United Farm Workers Union, which was led by Cesar Chavez. You can see Chavez at the bottom left-hand side of this slide, and you can see the UFW logo. And the UFW was very against illegal immigration because they were concerned that undocumented workers coming into the country, they would depress the the wages for unionized, overwhelmingly Latino, Mexican, and Mexican American farm workers who would have to compete with a whole new labor pool. In fact, the UFW and their supporters in some cases would patrol the U.S. border and try to stop undocumented enterers on their own. As time went on, Chavez and the UFW came around to supporting the '86 Immigration Control Act because of its criminalization of hiring illegal immigrant workers. But the point was, people at the time saw this as an anti-union measure, and Reagan, on the whole, was a anti-union politician when it came to policy issues. It really was not. Immigration was not as much of a illegal immigration and trying to control it was not as much of a conservative issue in the 1980s as it is in the 2010s and the 2020s. In fact, the little cartoon in the center here. I'm normally a staunch law and order type, but I'm making so much money paying cheap wages with no health care coverage. It's big business. At the time, people believed that big business benefited from illegal immigration, and that if you were a pro-business person, you were supposed to support illegal immigration. And pro-business sentiment is often linked with conservative sentiment. Certainly, that was more the case in the '80s than it is in the present, where in the present, conservatism is much more concerned about illegal immigration than it was in the past. So issues are always changing in politics. But this is an area where Reagan may in many ways have created the modern conservative movement. But the movement has changed somewhat since the 1980s. And some of the issues that Reagan supported in the '80s would not be considered conservative issues today. And that's not to say that America is more conservative now or more liberal now than it was in the past, but what it means to be conservative, what it means to be liberal, it changes with time and changes based on context. Now we'll sum up Ronald Reagan. In the end, Ronald Reagan was a complex and nuanced political figure. He's been identified as a conservative by many, and overall he was a conservative. He supported tax cuts, his endorsement of supply side economics, his slashing of welfare programs, and his aggressive stance against the communist USSR put him in the conservative camp, both in the 1980s and even in the present. Overall, his policies do lean more to the right, but he also did support some policies that would be considered more left-leaning, especially when it comes to gun control and elements of immigration. Reagan also supported the war on drugs, but he also called for drug treatment programs and increased awareness campaigns to educate people on the dangers of drug use. That was best seen through Nancy Reagan and the Just Say No campaign. And Reagan did increase spending on HIV and AIDS research, although, as I mentioned before, critics often said that he should have allocated more funds and made it more of a priority than he did. And they also criticize Reagan for abstinence-only sex education, and that his religious views and his attempts to court evangelical religious voters led to subpar policy choices. And Reagan also signed into law one of the biggest amnesty laws in U.S. history as well. It's an area where, economically speaking, from a business perspective, it would have reached the more pro-business conservatives, but the anti-immigration conservatives, especially those in more recent years, would have criticized Reagan. On the foreign policy front, while Reagan increased defense spending and promised to roll back the Soviet Union, he also signed important arms reduction agreements with Gorbachev and the Soviets, and he also supported armed militant organizations like the Mujahideen, which in recent years some people have said that this was a mistake because the Mujahideen, many of them went on to go on and found the Taliban, which will be a major problem for the United States in the 2000s, 2010s, and beyond. And although Reagan was still a conservative, he supported policies that people in the political center and left could support as well. And that leads Reagan to be remembered positively by most Americans. And scholars across the political spectrum, even if they disagree with Reagan on certain issues, they generally rank him as a above average president. And Reagan's successes as president will help to get his VP, George H.W. Bush, elected in 1988. Now we come to the 1988 U.S. presidential election in which George H.W. Bush, the incumbent vice president for the Reagan administration, ran against Michael Dukakis, the governor of Massachusetts. Bush Sr. was a Republican. He could run on the successes of the Reagan administration, which he was a critical part of. Dukakis was a Democrat and a very liberal Democrat by the standards of the day. And this was a very acrimonious election with both sides resorting to very harsh mudslinging tactics. The polls went back and forth. In the summer of 1988, Dukakis was in the lead for a while, but his poll numbers fell after some very disastrous presidential debates. And Dukakis, to many voters, just came off as naive and inexperienced compared to Bush, who had been vice president, who had been director of the CIA, and both men had actually served in World War II as well. Bush had been a pilot. A really interesting story about his military service in World War II, and Dukakis had actually been an enlisted man. He's actually one of only a couple major U.S. presidential candidates for major parties that were only enlisted personnel. The other that often gets talked about is James Buchanan, actually, back in 1856. All other major party U.S. presidential candidates, if they had military service, they served at least as officers. But to highlight his military service and to show his experience compared to Bush, there were ads in which Dukakis wore a helmet and rode around in military vehicles and tanks, and he just looked kind of silly and like a little kid playing army compared to Bush, who was more poised in the campaign. In addition, I think Bush had a much better campaign manager, a guy named Lee Atwater, who was a real attack dog for the Bush campaign, probably one of the most effective campaign managers in American political history. And the Bush campaign ran what was called the Willie Horton ads. William Horton, sometimes known as Willie Horton, was a man who was sentenced to life in prison for committing murder in Massachusetts. And Massachusetts had a policy, which was supported by Dukakis, that was a prison furlough program where people in prison could get out of prison for brief periods of time, and then they would voluntarily return to prison for like brief furloughs. The thing is, Horton, during one of the furloughs, left the state of Massachusetts. He went down to Maryland, where he stabbed a man and then really brutally SA'd the man's fiance. A really awful, horrific event. You can see how this program certainly would be misguided, and of course the Bush campaign used it to attack Dukakis. Well, Dukakis didn't make Horton do what he did. He had supported the program, and people suggested that the Bush campaign, harping on this issue, this was a racist thing, and Horton was an African American. They referred to him as Willie, even though he usually went by William, which they said was diminutive and therefore racist. But it was, there's no debate, though, that it was a very effective series of campaign ads. And it really, in the end, I think, killed the Dukakis campaign. It just made them seem hopelessly liberal and just out of touch to everyday voters. And the election returns bear this out. Bush won over 53% of the popular vote, and he took almost 80% of the electoral vote. Dukakis got his home state of Massachusetts. He got the state of West Virginia, which was still a state that was pretty competitive for the Democrats because of the presence of unions in the region. He got northeastern states like New York. He got some Midwestern states, an area that still has a pretty strong Democratic presence. But he did also get Pacific Northwestern states, including Washington and Oregon. Again, we're getting into a new party system, the sixth party system, in which the Republicans are strong in the South and the West, and the Democrats are strong or getting stronger on the East and West Coast, and then both parties are vying for the Midwest. And one last thing I'll say about George H.W. Bush and his presidency is that Bush Sr. Continued many of Reagan's policies, pressuring the Soviet Union, more aggressive foreign policy, but he was really less conservative than Reagan was, especially when it came to issues related to taxing and economics. Bush Sr., before he became Reagan's VP, was very critical of Reagan's proposed economic plans, of Reaganomics. He actually called it voodoo economics. Um, really, we talk about neoliberalism, and Reagan is often associated with neoliberalism. Sometimes Reagan is also associated with neoconservatism as well, which is a foreign policy stance that really in many ways becomes the dominant foreign policy philosophy in America from the 1980s really into the 2010s. I would argue neoconservatism in recent years is definitely on the rocks, but people often, I think, associate with Reagan, which I think is a mistake. I think it really should be associated with George Bush Sr. I think he was our first true neoconservative president. And neoconservatism is about aggressive foreign policy and nation building and things of that nature. And it often, though, means compromising with liberal politicians domestically in order to get foreign policy goals realized. And Bush was more willing to compromise with liberals on things like tax increases, for example, during his presidency. So neoconservatism often, I would argue, means aggressive foreign policy, nation building, what some might call a form of imperialism, but it often means supporting, in some cases, more liberal policies domestically in order to get foreign policy goals realized. And people will maybe disagree with that, but I look at the people who really helped to found neoconservatism as a political ideology. Bush Sr., then his son, George W. Bush, and earlier thinkers, people like Irving Kristol, for example, they often had really quite liberal domestic views, but they did believe in a very robust foreign policy. And now we're going to turn our attention to everyday life in 1980s America. And everyday life, of course, was impacted by foreign policy and foreign affairs, and everyday Americans were participating in elections, and they were aware of things that were going on both abroad and in Washington, D.C. You probably recall that I said that Reagan won the youth vote in the 1984 election. This reflected the popularity of conservative values amongst many young Americans in Generation X. Generation X being people who were born from about the mid-1960s to about the mid-1980s. And as you all know, young people usually like to repudiate the values of the generations that preceded them. And many young people, especially, I would say, young white people, saw the embrace of conservatism as a way to rebel against the baby boomers that were their parents or their teachers. Baby boomers had supported liberal policies like the Great Society welfare programs in the 1960s, and Gen Xers wanted to do things differently. They wanted to march to the beat of their own drum. And the rising conservative movement that really began to expand significantly in the 1970s. These young people are going to be kind of on the part of that wave of conservatism that grows in the 1980s. And in media, you can see portrayals of these conservative ideas. They become more common. For example, on the NBC television sitcom Family Ties, a family, the Keaton family, that was their name. The parents are an older liberal couple of the baby boomer generation, but they have a conservative and very business-minded, ambitious son. In the show, Michael J. Fox, the actor, plays Alex Keaton, who's the young, clean-cut conservative Republican who frequently spars with his progressive hippie parents who are struggling with the fact that they have a conservative child, but are also struggling with the fact that in some ways they have sold out. They've got jobs, they've settled down and are having children, they've bought a house in the suburbs, things that young people in the 60s would have thought were for squares and would have thought were uncool, they're now doing themselves. So it's an interesting show. And the show's creators, I think, intended for the show to appeal to both older and younger demographics. Older viewers are going to identify more with the parents, and younger viewers are going to identify more with the kids, particularly with Alex Keaton, Michael J. Fox's character. And I think it was similar to what happened with All in the Family, where Archie Bunker, the older conservative character of the World War II generation, he was meant to be the villain, the heel, the antagonist of the show. Um, but then people really liked his character. Something similar, I think, happened with Michael J. Fox's character. He was meant to be the antagonist of the family, who was up to no good and always looking for schemes to make money and getting into trouble. But a lot of young people of the Reagan generation really resonated with Alex Keaton, and this in some ways is going to lead to his rising stardom as an actor, and then getting roles in movies like Back to the Future, which also came out in the 1980s, that series. In the 1980s, similar to the 1970s, there was quite a bit of nostalgia for the 1950s, and 50s nostalgia in the 70s, I think, was driven by economic factors, the struggles the American economy was going through thanks to stagflation. Contrast this with the relative economic growth and prosperity of the 50s, and you can see why people in the 70s liked the 50s. But the 80s was a time of a more prosperous economy, but the 80s was a time also of an increasing national debt, concern about wealth disparities, concern about workers' rights being eroded. And so people are going to look back to the 50s as a time where there was more social harmony in America. And you really get that when you watch the movie Back to the Future, that uh, the economy of the 80s is good. It's things are dirtier and grungier perhaps than they were in the 50s. But really, what they sell with the 50s in a movie like Back to the Future is an America where there's a lot more social harmony. Of course, if you've been paying attention in this course, you know that there was a veneer of social harmony in the 1950s, but there was a lot of contentious issues in the 50s regarding the Cold War, the rising civil rights movement, and it wasn't really as good of a time as people would like to remember it as being. But it's still a powerful impulse in the 80s, and you can see that with the popularity of the Back to the Future movies, which were motivated by a longing for the social consensus of the 50s, which in some ways was driven by the rising 1980s conservative movement. But 1980s conservatism was quite different than the conservatism of previous decades. Really, I would argue that 80s conservatism had more in common with the conservatism of the 1920s than it did with the Eisenhower era dynamic conservatism of the 50s. And I'll give some more examples why in the coming slides. Young people in the 1980s were rejecting the counterculture of the 60s and 70s, which in many ways had become the dominant culture in America. They were identifying those cultural mores, marching for social change, things of that nature. They identified that with the older generations. Instead, younger people, young Gen Xers or the first Gen Xers that are coming of age, they're identifying with economic ambition, materialism, and conservative values. Um, some might say that it was harkening back to the values of the 50s, and they do like 50s nostalgia, but really the conservatism of the 80s has a lot more in common with that of the 1920s. Limited government, very little, less economic regulation, lower taxes, um, organized labor being weaker. These were all things that were happening in the 20s. The 20s was also a time of consumerism and of mass media marketing and buying goods and growing the economy, things of that nature. 50s conservatism was often very consumeristic, but in the 50s, you also had higher taxes, you had more protections for labor and for unions. Those protections were eroding after the Taft-Hartley Act of 1947. But in the 1950s, there was consumerism in American culture, but it was consumerism for the sake of patriotism. Buy goods to support the American capitalist economy and do it because you're patriotic. In the 80s, you bought goods so that you could make money, and you did it for your own ambitions and for your own desires, which really is much more individualistic and much more how things were in the 20s than in the 50s. And technology is going to be at the forefront in many ways of this business revolution that takes place in the 1980s. Computers have been around for decades by the 1980s, but they become smaller and much more efficient and much cheaper, and more parts can be made outside of the United States in places like Japan and Taiwan. Taiwan and Japan Taiwan still is an important producer of things like superconductors and chips like that. But in many ways, Japan was, for the American economy in the 80s, what the Chinese economy is for the United States today, a place of a manufacturing center that imports things to the U.S. Although Chinese goods nowadays have a reputation for being cheaper, but often of lower quality. Japan had a reputation for producing goods that were cheaper, but of higher quality. In the movie Back to the Future that I talked about before, Michael J. Fox's character Marty McFly is talking to Christopher Lloyd's character Dr. Brown, Emmett Brown, and it's been a while since I've seen the movie, but it's one of the scenes where he goes back in time to the 50s, and he's telling Doc Brown about the 80s and the future, and he makes a joke about Ronald Reagan, the actor, being president, of course, but he also says something to the effect of it's made in Japan. All the best things come from Japan, and Doc Brown can't believe that we would be importing goods from Japan, which is not good for American workers, and also for Doc Brown in the 50s. 10 years earlier, Japan was our enemy. So again, it shows how relationships can change over time. And there's some really interesting articles and research done on U.S.-Japanese relations in the 1980s and what you might almost call Japanese soft power, or even Japanese cultural imperialism in the United States. America had sought to change Japanese culture after World War II, and were very successful in doing so. But in some ways, you might say Japan tried to change American culture in the 80s, and people point to the popularity of American cars, Toyota, Honda. Marty McFly in the movie, he's very proud of his Toyota pickup truck that he drives. It's a nice vehicle, and he sees it as much better quality than American-made vehicles. But there's even been some really interesting research on manga and anime coming into the United States from Japan in the 80s. But computers is what I'm going to focus on here. And in 1981, IBM releases the personal computer. A few years later, in 1984, the Macintosh by Apple Incorporated founder, people like Steve Jobs, it's going to be released a few years later as a competitor. And for many years, you were either a PC person or a Mac person. Nowadays, I don't think this is as big of a debate anymore. But personal computers, whether you're using a Mac or whether you're using a PC, they allow people to be much more productive and much more efficient and to get a lot more work done. And they really revolutionized working in the late 20th century. They lead to more productivity, but in many ways they also lead to a lot more busy work and a lot more things like email messages, kind of like how the typewriter really, the typewriter at the end of the 1800s, it's in some ways technologically what enabled the mass bureaucratic expansion of the progressive era. Technology has a big impact on historical developments. The typewriter in the late 1800s, the computer in the late 1900s, smartphones in the late 2000s, early 2010s, they're going to change work and people's relationship with work. So I enjoy computers and I enjoy video games. And the 1980s was a period where there was a lot of change to the video game world, and there had been some early video game systems and arcade games in the late 1970s, but the release of personal computers, many argue, in some ways caused the video game crash of 1983 to 1985. Just there's technological cross-pollination between computers and between video game consoles. And the console market becomes much more consolidated after 1985. There are companies that were making consoles in the early 80s that simply go out of business. And also this video games crash, it impacted arcade games as well. Arcade games became less popular after this period because you could play video games at home on a few consoles versus having to go to a video arcade. So games, really classic games like Pac-Man from 1980 and Donkey Kong from 1981, for example, they're still going to be around. They're still going to survive. But the era of the arcade is going to be not over, but it's going to be much less significant after the mid 1980s. The thing is, the crash did lead to the release of better video game consoles that were more capable, could run bigger, heavier games. For example, people often point to the Nintendo Entertainment Systems, the NES family computer, or Famicom of 1985. They could play better games. And really, the video game crash, it's not just trivia or interesting information for video game players. This is evidence of the volatility of the 1980s global economy and really of America becoming a more neoliberal economy. We're taking part in global trade, which means cheaper goods, but things can change on a dime, and it can lead to companies going out of business. What goes up must go down, and that's another reason why I argue that the 1980s economy, really in many ways, along with 1980s conservatism, it's a lot more like the 1920s than it is like the 1950s, for example. I also enjoy talking about artifacts and material culture, and in the field of history, studies of material culture and artifacts, they're usually, within American history anyway, they're usually confined to colonial times and maybe the early Republic, late 1700s, early 1800s. My advisor at Ohio State, she was trying to move the study of artifacts further into later periods, into the Civil War era and beyond. And I would like to do that more by looking at things like toy sales in the 1980s, because again, we have global trade, we have things being made in Japan and Taiwan and other emerging markets. This was done because the goods could be produced cheaper elsewhere, and having factories set up in these countries would make these countries more prosperous and make them less likely to support communism. This was actually a part of the fighting of the Cold War, believe it or not. And in the 1980s, there were television shows that were designed to sell toys to children. That may sound like a very cynical thing to say, but it's true. But the thing is, of course, if the show is bad, if it's low quality, the toys are not going to sell. So I don't see it as necessarily a bad thing, creating a television show just to sell toys to children. A few examples of these shows are things like G.I. Joe from 1983 to 1986, He-Man from 1983 to 1985. It's very both of these shows I think are very emblematic of the 1980s. They're with G.I. Joe, it's patriotic, traditional ideas of masculinity, but at the same time they're also marketing to women as well, and they're marketing to people of different races. There are women who are characters, there are African Americans who are characters, and they're doing this so they can reach children, girls who might want to buy a figurine or a action figure from this show. They might want to reach African American children who will buy an action figure of one of the African American characters. It's diversity, but it's being done in the name of business and commerce. It's very 1980s. And you see something similar with He-Man, Masters of the Universe as well, which will eventually have a spin-off show of its own that targets um, girls. I'd also point to Transformers, which comes out in 1984, And Transformers, it was a syncretism of Japanese and American culture, something that's happening in the 1980s, a lot of Japanese soft power and marketing in the U.S., and it's a reflection, again, of globalization and the American economy becoming much more globalized. And they also created television shows and toys that were marketed more to girls than to boys. Examples are shows like My Little Pony from 1984, which I think had a revival in the early 2000s. And apparently, there were a lot of young men that really liked the later version of My Little Pony, which is rather strange to me. I don't really understand it, but to each their own, I guess. You also have shows like Strawberry Shortcake from 1980. You have shows like She-Ra, Princess of Power, which was a spin-off of the previously mentioned He-Man. And these shows are trying to sell toys to young girls. And what I've noticed, and this is not just something you see with toys, but with fashion as well, it's more acceptable for women or girls to wear boys' clothing, things that were previously associated with the male gender, whether it's trousers, pants, boots, or baseball caps, or with toys. It's more acceptable for a young girl to play with a He-Man action figure or even a She-Ra action figure than it is for a boy to play with a My Little Pony, which I even said myself, I thought it was strange that boys would like My Little Pony, highlighting this. And there's debate about why this is. I think it's because we do live in a patriarchal society, so it makes more sense for young girls and women to aspire to take on male cultural symbols than it does for boys and men to take on female cultural symbols. That might be a product of a patriarchal system, I would say. The 1980s was also a decade of great music as well, and there's certain songs that I think were very emblematic of the 1980s that certain bands did, where they really captured the feel of the decade. And when I think of songs that are emblematic, I think of Huey Lewis and the News, It's Hip to Be Square, which came out in 1986. It was part of the Four album. Four, F-O-R-E, is in what you shout in golf after you've hit the golf ball. And the song is about how they used to be renegades, they used to be crazy and getting into trouble, and now they're settling down and they're cutting their hair and they're getting real jobs. And it really captures the feeling of a lot of older baby boomer type people who are getting into their careers and settling down and having families by the 1980s, buying homes and things of that nature, things that they would have thought were, square when they were younger. But now it's hip to be square because they're adults and they're growing up. And they're trying to follow these consumerist trends. But a lot of younger people that I've talked to, people who are of Gen X who heard the song It's Hip to Be Square, they interpreted the song a little bit differently. They liked the song too, but they saw it as a much more aspirational tune. That, yeah, this is what they wanted to do. They wanted to be square. They wanted to have good jobs and make good money and dress well and exercise and eat healthy and be responsible, be adults, even at a very young adolescent age. They also capture the 1980s exercise craze too, with their songs about their lines about eating healthy and being more health conscious. Madonna's song Material Girl, I think also captures the feel of the 1980s as well, and that in the 1980s you buy what you want, engage in consumerism in a very unapologetic manner, not because you have to be patriotic, to fit in with society, to conform, to curate your image, but because you want to. You want these things, and that's what the 80s is all about. If you want it, buy it. And I'd love to be able to play a little bit of these songs, but if I do, this video will probably get taken down from YouTube. You can look up these songs. I often like to play a little bit of the songs in my in-person classes for students, especially It's Hip to Be Square. I also like to play the scene from American Psycho where Christian Bale's character his character was named Patrick Bateman, and the movie American Psycho is it actually came out in 2000, but it's based on a novel by Bret Easton Ellis from 1991, in which he talks about 80s business culture. So it's also an 80s movie that's really great to watch, even though it technically came out in 2000 and it's a 1991 novel. You can watch it alongside movies like Wall Street Never Sleeps, for example, or the aforementioned Back to the Future movies if you really want to have a tour of 1980s cinema. A couple of other pieces of media, or technically songs, that I think really capture 80s culture are Dolly Parton's 1980 song 9 to 5, which draws attention to women working outside of the home. By the late 70s and early 80s, the majority of American households had dual income, that is, the both parents working outside of the home. And 1983's Girls Just Want to Have Fun by Cyndi Lauper as well, which draws attention to young women wanting to rebel against some of the social and sexual mores that were beginning to take hold in 1980s America as a result of the end of the sexual revolution and the rising conservative movement during this decade. Of course, no discussion about 80s music and culture would be complete without talking about Michael Jackson, the king of pop. In Michael Jackson, he blended elements of Motown, rock and roll, and hip hop to create American popular or pop music that's still around to this day. One of the most famous and successful musicians, singers, artists, performers of all time. His albums like Thriller sold over 60 million copies and really revolutionized American popular music and became a really important cultural figure. Certainly, he was a man with of great, unusual talent, but definitely dealt with his own personal demons behind the scenes and had his personal struggles and controversies as well, which only came to light long after the 1980s had come to an end. But in 1983, he performed dance moves like the moonwalk to the song Billie Jean, and the audience was so amazed they didn't know what they'd just witnessed. It seemed like Jackson was defying the laws of physics on the dance floor, and probably my favorite Michael Jackson song that I think is the most emblematic of the 1980s is it's not Thriller or Billie Jean or Bad or Beat It, which are all great songs, but Smooth Criminal. And I really say that because the music video for Smooth Criminal, which in 1988 was when that video was released, and in that video, Jackson performs his famous anti-gravity lean, in which it seemed like he defied the laws of physics again. But in that video, he's wearing kind of 1920s style, almost like gangster throwback clothing. He has a fedora hat on, a sort of a old style baggy suit, like what you would have seen someone wearing in the 20s. And again, it's the link between 1980s culture and 1920s culture. And I think Jackson really showed that in Smooth Criminal. And because he was such a culturally relevant figure, he met with multiple U.S. presidents. And 1980s fashion demonstrated the adoption of conservative and materialistic values that had really become vogue in American society, especially amongst younger people. You no longer had to pretend to be against consumerism and against capitalism the way you had to in previous decades. You could really lean into the capitalist economy and buy what you wanted to. And you see this with fashion as well. In the early 1980s, fashion is more mute, it's more understated, it's lighter pastel colors, it's Oxford shirts for men, and very understated clothing for women. And this sartorial choice, this fashion choice in the early 1980s, it's a reflection of two things. The first thing, it is a reflection of an economy that is still struggling. it's the 80s economy doesn't really get going until really 1983 or so. So the economy is still in a pretty bad place in 81 and 82. And in bad economies, you see more muted clothing, less vivid, less bright colors. Everybody kind of wants to conform. They don't want to seem unusual. They want to make sure they can get a good job. I think you maybe even see this today in some 2020s fashion. Also, the fashion of the early 80s with its Oxford shirts and its more muted color palettes, it's a clear rejection of the really bright, vivid colors of the 70s, whether it was the really outlandish, purposefully outlandish colors worn by the counterculture movement at the beginning of the decade, or the brighter colors of disco fashion later in the 70s. Also, Oxford shirts have button-down collars that are more understated compared to the really big, massive collars that you see in the 1970s. So again, it's a rebellion against the 70s, and it's also a sign of a economy that's still struggling in the early 80s regarding fashion. In the mid 1980s, fashion gets to be a lot more varied. You see a lot more subculture fashion. Colors get brighter again as well, and this is a reflection of the economy becoming better, more choices being available to consumers. It's also a reflection of global trade as well. Clothing can be imported from other parts of the world where it can be made more cheaply. And as I said in a previous video, when clothing is cheaper, often because it's made in other countries, you can afford to be a bit more bold and experimental with the clothes you buy, because if you don't like it, you can just get rid of it and try something else that suits you more. Whereas in previous decades, when clothing was more expensive, you really had to choose very strategically what you bought, because if you didn't like it or if it didn't look good on you, there wasn't a whole lot you could do. And also, because of the culture of the 80s, the business culture, the consumerist culture, conspicuous consumption became acceptable, and really in some ways became all the rage in the 1980s. Women and men began wearing flashy costume jewelry and designer branded clothing and accessories, along with bright colors, whether it was Hawaiian shirts like Tom Selleck from Magnum PI, whether it was or bright pastel colored suits from shows like Miami Vice. Really, you see that fashion in the 1980s, especially in the mid 1980s, gets to be a lot brighter and a lot more, I would say, brighter and more exuberant, reflecting the economic growth of the mid 1980s. You also have subculture fashion as well. You have different types of fashion being marketed to different groups of people. For women, particularly for women that are entering the white-collar workforce, shoulder pads are encouraged, because shoulder pads were designed to make women look stronger and more muscular in the workforce. This is a trend that you actually see in the 1940s as well, when women were entering the out-of-home workforce as well. 1980s was also a period which athleisure became more popular. You see this throughout fashion for both men and women and across various communities. As I mentioned previously, you actually see that athleisure became popular in the Soviet Union as well, because of the Soviet-Afghan War and because of the 1980 Olympics. So it's always interesting when you see these trends taking place in other parts of the world. And here's Jane Fonda doing an exercise video. Her film career, her celebrity career, never really recovered after her visit to Hanoi in 1972. She went from being a well-known and popular actress to making exercise videos by the 1980s. In the late 1980s, you see similar trends with fashion as well. Subculture fashion, really bright colors. You see the surfer, skater, California style becomes a lot more popular in the latter part of the 1980s. California was a place of significant economic growth in the second half of the 20th century, after World War II and really through the 1980s. And California began to export, have many cultural exports in this period. You see the punk subculture becomes more popular in America as well. There's debate about whether the punk subculture started in the United States or if it started in Britain, but it ends up being kind of a transatlantic culture. And African American fashion also will impact general American fashion as well. You particularly see this with the popularity of baggy MC Hammer pants towards the end of the 1980s, which actually seem to be having a bit of a resurgence in the 2020s. Before we wrap up this video, there are a couple of important Supreme Court cases that are decided in the 1980s. And these are cases that are decided primarily by the Rehnquist Court, which began in 1986 and ran until 2005. Rehnquist was a reference to William Rehnquist, who was Supreme Court justice during this period from the 80s into the 2000s. And he was, of course, a Reagan appointee, as was Sandra Day O'Connor, the first female Supreme Court justice, who I talked about briefly before. We'll start by talking about the Hazelwood v. Kuhlmeyer case first. In 1983, the principal of the Hazelwood High School in St. Louis, Missouri, removed articles in a student newspaper that were about teen pregnancy and divorce, and that had information about the families of students. The names have been changed, but there was concern that readers would be able to identify who was being talked about, and so the principal removed these articles, essentially censored these articles, citing concern about bullying and about time constraints. And the student journalists who produced the paper, they sued, and they appealed all the way to the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court sided with the Circuit Court and the school, declaring that the First Amendment, our freedom of speech protections, did not preclude the school's administrative censorship, that this censorship did not violate the First Amendment. It was necessary to have the school continue its operations and to prevent bullying and to get the school newspaper out on time. And in this case, the conservative justices took a narrower view of what protections are outlined in the First Amendment, whereas the liberal justices took a broader interpretation of the First Amendment. And this is an early case of the Rehnquist Court, which began in 86. And this, on the whole, was a more conservative Supreme Court than the Burger Court before it. They take a more narrow view of the Bill of Rights and of the U.S. Constitution. And now we'll come to an even more controversial case in the Rehnquist Court. And this is Texas v. Johnson from 1989. In 1984, activist Gregory Johnson burned the American flag outside the GOP National Convention in Dallas. Johnson was a far-left activist, a Marxist activist, and he was protesting the GOP and really protesting America as a whole by burning the American flag. And he was convicted of desecration of the flag, and he was sentenced to prison and to fines. And he appealed this ruling to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court controversially sided with Johnson, ruling that symbolic speech, such as burning the American flag, was protected by the First Amendment. And that Johnson's statement by burning the flag did not constitute incitement or what was called imminent lawless action. And that's the Brandenburg v. Ohio case of 1969, in which in the Brandenburg v. Ohio case, First Amendment protections were expanded. The U.S. government could no longer censor speech that it considered to be a clear and present danger. That was Schenck v. United States in 1919. Now they can only ban speech that will lead to imminent lawless action. And the decision was that Johnson was burning the American flag, and while this was a distasteful display and a disrespectful display, he was not directly calling people to imminent lawless action by burning the flag. Therefore, his speech was distasteful and not illegal, and thus it was protected. And this Supreme Court case, it will lead to the invalidation of anti-flag burning laws in about 48 of the 50 states. This was actually a very unpopular Supreme Court decision, very controversial. The majority of Americans opposed the decision because it was interfering with state laws, and it was the burning of the American flag, a cherished symbol to the average American. And this decision by SCOTUS did lead to attempts to pass federal laws that would make flag burning illegal, most notably attempts led by Bob Dole, Republican senator from Kansas. Bob Dole doesn't like it when you burn the American flag. If you know, you know. All in all, the 1980s was a landmark decade in U.S. history. It saw the election and policies of Ronald Reagan, one of the most important leaders in the American conservative movement, demonstrating a rightward shift in American politics that would continue for years after the decade had ended. The 1980s also saw the creation of new political coalitions as the Republican Party gained ground in the South and continued to build a coalition between white Southerners, evangelicals, and blue-collar workers across the country. The Democratic Party would continue to make gains with minority voters and left-leaning liberal white voters across the country, particularly along the East and West Coast and in urban areas. The 1980s is when the sixth party system begins, and the sixth party system, people generally say that it either is still going or that it ended in 2016. And the decade also saw the reversal of the détente foreign policy as Reagan and his successor, George H.W. Bush, took a harder line against the Soviet Union and America's other adversaries, which will lead to the USSR's eventual dissolution in 1991. On the domestic side of politics, modern conservatism, especially when it came to economic issues, became mainstream in American politics and in American culture, leading many government spending and welfare programs to fall out of favor amongst the American population, especially amongst right-leaning Americans. Culturally, the decade showed the clash between young Generation X conservatives of the Reagan generation and the more liberal counterculture supporting baby boomers, who were themselves having a bit of an identity crisis by the 1980s as they were getting older, they were getting into their careers, they were buying homes, and they were settling down and having families. This tension between liberalism and conservatism is especially evident in 1980s media and fashion.